Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Weekly National News Briefing. I'm Sandy Close, EMS Director, and today's moderator. Hate speech is escalating. We hear it everywhere, as if there are no rules anymore about what you can say in public and what you can't. The language used to demonize immigrants by former President Trump and others uses words like rapist, murderer, criminal, and it grows uglier by the day as immigration emerges as a key wedge issue in the 2024 presidential campaign. This political hate speech has real-world consequences, especially in immigrant communities that are remote and often invisible, such as migrant workers, who also are the folks who ensure we have food on our tables. In this briefing, we hear from a sociologist, journalist, two advocate organizers, and a farm worker about the impact that anti-immigrant rhetoric has on themselves, their communities, and people across the agricultural sector. And we're focusing on California because it has the largest population of migrant workers in the country. It is rare to hear from these workers because they are isolated by language and geography, as well as fear. So we're grateful for today's opportunity. Our speakers include Manuel Ortiz Escamez, sociologist, audio-visual journalist, and co-founder of Península 360 in Redwood City, who will also play a video of an interview with Juanita, a farm worker in California's Siskiyou County. Arcenio Lopez, executive director of the Mixteco Indigenous Community Organizing Project, MICOP, in Ventura, California, and Gustavo Gasca Gomez, coordinator of the Stop the Hate Project and immigration outreach specialist with Education and Leadership Foundation in the Central Valley. We will send a video of today's briefing along with expanded bios for each speaker later today and video excerpts of the presentations early next week. We begin with an overview by Manuel Ortiz, who taught sociology at the University of Mexico, UNAM, for 7 years with a special focus on immigration before returning full-time to journalism. He now runs Península 360 and reports on farm workers, especially in California's rural north. Mr. Ortiz, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandy. It's always a pleasure to be in this briefing. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor, and it's a pleasure to share this with Arcenio Lopez and Gustavo Gasca. Well, I like to I'm gonna split my presentation into two parts. The first part, I like to speak more about the historical context of anti-immigrant ideology in the United States. I will try to be very fast to have these both parts. And despite the important role of migrants in their countries where they go, the rejection of this sector is a constant in almost all immigration processes, and this is not just in the United States, it's everywhere. The rejection, according to George Marine, as a social researcher, is greatest with people whose ethnicity, language, religion, or appearance is significantly different from that of the destination countries. It's very different from the people in the country they arrive. In the United States, migrants have faced a paradox. For one side, because of the huge need of cheap labor, and in the other side, because of the rejection of these migrants as members of society. Saying that, I like to stop to have a concept in mind that I'm gonna be talking about that, the concept of enemy and building the enemy. One of the authors to talking about this is the Italian philosopher Umberto Eco. Of course, he's not the only one, but he published this book, Inventing the Enemy. In Italian in English is inventing, but in Italian and Spanish is the creation of the enemy, because the enemy is a creation. Politics need an enemy, because the enemy creates the feeling of emergency, creates unity, and the need of a savior, of a hero. What is the enemy like? Well, the enemy is both physically and morally repugnant. The enemy stinks, the enemy is ugly, and the enemy could be a murderer or a rapist. The enemy, and this is very important to have in mind, the enemy wants to take away what is yours. The construction of the enemy from the power tends to be deeply, says Umberto Eco, deeply racist. And that is why migrants, the train is passing very close, but migrants have been the ideal enemy of some political campaigns. This has been repeated by decades of some politicians in the United States, and the data shows that it works. For example, I'm gonna do a pause here. Recently, discussing with a young guy about why people support Donald Trump, and he said people support Donald Trump not because people is against immigrants, and it's because the economy, but data say, and I'm gonna put the links into the chat. Data show that the main reason people support Donald Trump during his past campaigns was two reasons. One was the anti-migrant rhetoric, and the other one, the sexist rhetoric. So I like to have this in mind, the construction of the enemy. Now I like to go very fast on some periods of the history, of course. Of course, I'm gonna jump many important periods. I'm just gonna try to go fast of some very basic points. The Irish were the first group of migrants to massively influence the U.S. industry during the 30s and 40s of the 19th century. At those days, it was a lot of propaganda inviting Irish to come to the United States to work, but at the same time, it was the creation of this anti-Irish sentiment. And this image shows where we were talking about the creation of the enemy. This image portraits the Irish as not as a human, as a monster. And this image is a series of images, similar images. And this is, we have to have in mind and remember the Know Nothing. The official name was Know Nothing Party during the 1850. It was a political movement based in Kansas and Nebraska, but with their ideology, the ideas influenced the whole country, and we could in some ways compare this the Know Nothing, what they call also the Know Nothing Party, to the Donald Trump movement these days. This movement and the idea anti-Irish ideas influence people like Samuel Moore, influence important thinkers of that moment. Samuel Moore was the creator of the Telegraph, and he wrote this book in 1834, Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. It's basically a book, an essay against Irish. We have to also have in mind the important contribution of Chinese migration to the United States, especially during 1850 and 1869. Chinese workers came to work in the gold mines, also some farm workers in factories, but very important, they contribute to build the railroads, one of the most important railroads in this country, even these days. But at the same time, they face this paradox. At the same time, it was once they built the railroads, and during the building of the railroads, it was this sentiment, anti-Chinese sentiment. In your left, you can see an advertisement of detergent that uses Chinese as a part of an advertisement. And in your left, you can see the Chinese Exclusion Act passes by the Congress in 1882. Something that I think is very important to highlight these days is something called the Dillingham Commission that in 1911 published. It was several volumes. It's a study that the Congress of the United States asked us, a group of social researchers, anthropologists, with a very extremely racist content. Basically, what this document says, and is very important even these days, is a recommendation of how to treat different immigrants. About Mexicans, the Dillingham Commission says they are very good workers, but they are lazy. They tend to be criminals. So our recommendation is, wasn't only for Mexicans. Our recommendation is bring migrants, use them for 7 years is a good period of where they can be good workers, but then expose them. And this document, it's related, I'm going to go into that, but this document is related to the immigration law from then to now. Many of the immigration law in the United States is still based in the Dillingham Commission. And these are 4 periods that the sociologist Jorge Durant analyzed of this part to see. This is a good sample to see how this paradox works. In 1920, it was an opening because of the expansion of the economy in the United States and the participation of the United States in the World War I. So the United States openly brought many Mexican migrants because the need of cheap labor. And then the second period, 1921, 1939, the economy recession, during this period was the creation of the border patrol. And 1942, 1964, they promote again the entrance of migrants. This is called the Bracero program period, and this is in part because of the participation of the United States in the World War II. They needed again cheap labor. But in 1965 and 1986, again they reinforced the border, and it was a very deep anti-Mexican, anti-Latino sentiment. And this period is marked because of the economy, which was more based in the local national trade, became more dependent on international, was what we call neoliberalism. And something that I like to have in mind is what we have and what we could lose, because not everything of the immigration history in the United States has been terrible and bad. And this is very important. It's very important that we recognize that the civil and human rights movement, it's also have roots in international, also have roots in the United States. During the 40s during 40s, 50s, and 60s, many movements, and this is thanks to activists, thanks to journalists, thanks to social researchers, thanks to organizations. It was it was the creation of this idea that we must respect immigrants. We cannot be openly racist. Of course, the racism has been in this country since the beginning, since the beginning of the formation of the country, but a little by little, it was the idea that it's not okay to attack migrants. In 1948 was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 1950, the United Nations created the ACNUR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And in 1988, we have this phrase, no human being is illegal. Some says that the first one to say this phrase was Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor. I don't know, I was looking, but some says it was another one. But it's during this period that this idea of nobody is illegal was spread in the United States. So this is in the United States and in the world, we have built codes that helps in many ways to respect others, in many ways to respect migrants. Again, it's not perfect, but we have that. We have that in the United States. And now I like to present these two guys in the photo. The first one in the back is Samuel Huntington, who was an important, very important academic that wrote a book called The Clash of Civilization in 1996. He also wrote an article, an essay in October of 2009. And the guy in front is Donald Trump. Huntington was the inspiration for many politicians. Huntington was a tireless voice of alarm of the danger that others represent to white and Protestant fundamentals in the United States. Who is the enemy? Because Huntington, I think, because he already passed away, Huntington was an expert in the art of building the enemy. And who was the enemy for Huntington? Well, the enemy for Huntington was anyone who is not white, to have came from British blood, and someone who is not Protestant. So who are the enemies for Huntington? Who were the enemies for Huntington? As Muslim, Asians, and Latinos. In an article published by Carlos Fuentes in the Spanish newspaper El País, Carlos Fuentes was a very well-known Mexican writer who used also to live in the United States. He says Huntington was the masked racist. But the difference between Huntington, who was an academic, and Donald Trump is that we are breaking what we built during so many years, this idea that it's not okay to be directly racist. What the difference is that Huntington was at least masked. But Donald Trump era is actually letting us that it's okay to be racist. We could be entering in a fascist period where it's okay. It's okay to be racist, and I believe a second term of Donald Trump could lead us to a fascist period where the first to suffer will be the migrants, but not only the migrants will be the enemy, the enemy. A little by little, those in power will target the enemy will be anyone who question the power. That's very dangerous. This is not just for immigrants. It will be for all the country, for anyone who in any way do not support what is going on. And now in my second part of the presentation, I like to talk about the recent trip that I did to Tule Lake. And this image corresponds to a focus group that I did with women in Tule Lake, California. Tule Lake, it's a little remote town in the Siskiyou County. During this focus group, we had a conversation about different topics. One of them was what's going on during the elections. Basically, everyone agreed that migrants are experiencing a feeling of anxiety and fear. So this is affecting even in health because some people is not getting, for example, medical because they are afraid because it could take as a public charge. And they said that during this period of Donald Trump, many of the kids in this town suffered bullying because in the schools they said, "Oh, you will be once Donald Trump is here, now is here, your family will be deported." Uh, but it's very interesting because these days, some of these kids who used to be bullied, used to suffer bullying, and now supporting Donald Trump. And I asked why, and they said it's because they want to belong. It's because you have to belong in a society that is turning into very racist. For young people, it's very difficult to be out, so they want to belong. And one way they have to be quiet, or they have to show support for the bullies. Now I like to share a video. Oh, no. I like to share a video. Okay.
Yo me llamo Juana Chaboya, soy una trabajadora campesina. Yo me dedico a trabajar en la menta, ahorita lo que es el verano. Y en el invierno trabajo en un empaque donde se limpia la papa. Aquí en el valle es lo que se siembra, papa, ajo, menta, cebolla. Sí nos sentimos atacados y discriminados por Donald Trump porque su manera de dirigirse para nosotros los latinoamericanos lastima, muy hiriente. Nosotros estamos aquí no porque quieren andar lejos de su casa o de su patria. La necesidad de una vida mejor, de poder uno tener un plato de comida más seguro, donde sus necesidades de uno sean cubiertas más. Y no hemos venido con el pensamiento de venir a destruir, ni a dañar, ni a violar reglamentos de las personas que no comprenden el trabajo de uno, su labor de uno y que no la valoran. Sería que fueran con uno un ratito para hacerlo y tal vez ahí sí fueran más conscientes y más agradecidos. Siento que son crueles al catalogarnos como invasores a veces o nos etiquetan como personas malas. Nuestro trabajo habla por nosotros, porque gracias a Dios y a la fuerza, al esfuerzo que hacemos, los vegetales, las frutas, los alimentos frescos, llegan a cada hogar, llegan a cada tienda. Nosotros cumplimos con nuestros impuestos, nosotros cumplimos con respetar la ley. Nosotros cumplimos con apoyar nuestra comunidad. De hecho, hay personas americanas aquí muy buenas y tenemos muy buena relación con ellos. Nos sentimos que somos parte de aquí porque somos personas que venimos con un pensamiento y un corazón limpio para progresar, para hacer crecer también esta nación. Yo siento que si nosotros también no fuéramos de esa manera de trabajar, tal vez fuera diferente también para esta nación, porque le puedo explicar que en los 16 años que yo tengo aquí, viviendo aquí en Estados Unidos, me ha tocado mirar americanos trabajar en el field donde ando yo, como a unos 3 nada más. Y no duran. El trabajo se les hace duro y no quieren estar ahí o no pueden. Muchos sienten que no pueden. Es muy fácil ir a tu mesa o ir a tu refri y tomar tu banana, tomar tu manzana, tomar tu fruta de ahí. Pero ir y estarla cuidando desde que pones la semilla, estarla atendiendo, hacer crecer esa planta, hacerla que florezca y que produzca, y ir y cosechar el fruto para que tú lo puedas tener ahí. Es difícil para nosotros, pero uno lo hace con amor. ¿Por qué? Porque esa es su labor de uno. Gracias a Dios es la enseñanza que tal vez hemos recibido de hacer nuestra labor campesina lo mejor que se pueda. Porque muchas personas tal vez no conocen lo que es ir y trabajar todo el día con una sazón. Se ve fácil. A veces la hierba está bien dura y a veces le duelen a uno todos los huesos, sus manos de uno. Viene uno a veces con sus pies bien hinchados del calor. El calor inflama los pies a uno. Y a veces todo sediento que llega uno y se sienta y se queda uno sentado en una silla hasta con la boca abierta y dormido, de cansancio. Y toda la semana es lo mismo, es lo mismo. pero a darle para adelante, porque eso es lo que nosotros hemos venido, a luchar para salir adelante, para ser de bendición para los demás, para echar para adelante a nuestros hijos.
Thank you, Manuel, for that great
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy.
historical overview and for sharing the really very moving interview to hear the words directly of the farm worker from Tule Lake. I'm going to skip questions because of time and go directly to our second speaker, Gustavo Gasca, who works with the Education and Leadership Foundation in the Central Valley. Gustavo, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you again for having me. And yes, Gustavo Gasca Gomez with the Education Leadership Foundation, currently program coordinator for the Stop to Hate project through the California Department of Social Services. We, as an organization, are a nonprofit. We are a nonprofit 501c3 based here in Fresno, trying to support all of the immigrant populations, community, first generation children of immigrants, with connecting them to higher education and immigration services. We have recognition and accreditation through the U.S. Department of Justice to provide assistance with different immigration benefits, as long as the individual is able to demonstrate that they have sufficient evidence, documentation, and that we have capacity to proceed with a given matter or process. Now, as the Stop the Hate, we want to empower our immigrant communities that have been affected either directly or whose families have been affected by discrimination instances, whether it be a hate crime or a hate incident, based off any of the number of the protected characteristics, nation of origin, ethnicity, disability, and so on. I want to speak about my personal plight as an undocumented person. I am a DACA recipient. I am a beneficiary of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals that President Obama signed as an executive order in 2012. I have been a beneficiary since 2012, but alas, it is simply minor benefit compared to a longer lasting permanent status. I'm not a permanent resident. I'm not a citizen, and I still am undocumented. I'm undocumented with what I consider just a sliver of privilege. I do have the right to work. I do have Social Security, but I do not have the ability to vote, do not have the ability to leave the country and return without express permission. Now, the reason why I say this is because as an undocumented individual, I am deeply affected and impacted by what is being said by the Republican presidential nominee, by other politicians, as they are continuing to perpetuate these stereotypes and all of these thoughts that are demeaning not just me, but other people that come from my community, whether it's individual from Mexico, as I'm from Guanajuato, or whether it's someone that is from Southeast Asia, someone that is from the Middle East. We are all immigrants and we are all affected, impacted by this. I have reached out to numerous partner organizations, California Farm Worker Foundation, Unidad Benito Popular Benito Juárez, el Centro Binacional para el Desarrollo Indígena Oaxaqueña, and they have all expressed that there is anxiety and there is fear amongst their constituents. Most of them, 99% of them, are farm workers, and they feel directly impacted. They have an increased amount of anxiety and fear as to what will happen in the future. Their majority of their concerns currently surround, as Manuel mentioned, the issue of public charge. Without proper understanding and without the necessary education, they feel as if they will be directly targeted and they will be, if not in the future, be deported, that they will not be able to access healthcare benefits that either they do qualify or their children can qualify. And in many cases, these children are US citizens and they do deserve these rights, these benefits. Now, I was a former farm worker prior to my status as a DACA recipient. I do have the added pleasure and privilege of working in an office now, but when I was younger, when I was 18, right out of high school, and had no other means to obtain a job legally, I did work in the fields. And I did realize that the work is difficult. Not only is it hot, but it's dirty and it's tedious and it makes your mind numb in many ways. But it's still, I found, a respectable job and something that's still very much necessary, not just for the self-sustenance that farm workers and their families depend on, but also the entire community, the entire country of America. The US depends on the labor of individuals like my parents, like my family, working in the fields, working in the packing houses, in the warehouses. And I have been there and I have seen it. And I've spoken recently to clients and I've asked them how they are interpreting and how I have interpreted what messages at rallies, conventions. How can it not faze me and how can it not faze my community when there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of people holding up mass deportation now signs and it is being broadcast on the national news, on stations, being relayed in print? And how can it not make a person like myself or my community feel a certain type of way? And I express this because I am still the human, and I am still, despite my limitations, committed to this country. And just as the title says, we didn't come here to cause harm. And I know this because when my parents brought us over 31 years ago, it was with good intentions. I appreciate all your time.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. We have questions which I'll save for the end of our third speaker. So please stay with us. Thank you so much for sharing the personal story. Our next speaker is no stranger to our briefings. He's been with us, like Manuel, on key occasions, and we welcome Arcenio Lopez, Executive Director of MICOP, who will share the experiences of Indigenous migrant workers. Arcenio, welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invite. Always my pleasure to do my best and be in these spaces. My name is Arcenio Lopez. I'm the Executive Director of Mixteco Indigena Community Organizing Project, MICOP, or Proyecto Mixteco. We're based in Ventura County. More recently, we have expanded to Santa Barbara County and San Luis Obispo, so we're in 3 counties now. We work primarily with the indigenous migrant communities from Mexico. The large population, I would say, for the agriculture sector in this area, which is the work that we do, is Mixtecos. But we also have the Zapoteco population, as well as other indigenous migrants from Mexico, like Purepecha, Nahuatl, Triqui, Huaves, you call it, from, communities from the 68 indigenous nations of Mexico. I honestly been thinking about like what to share here in this space, and I'm like navigating the different thoughts. One of it is like I'm thinking about the whole hate speech. I'm thinking about racism and all what implies into that, and I'm thinking about like individuals, how individuals, what their roles are into all these unfortunate situations, right? Like there is this one person who come out and start saying, using words that is very that cause a lot of damage, harms into individuals, in this case immigrant population, we want to see it that way. But then I'm thinking like, how is it possible that this individual who like authorize and who like normalize and who accept and support this person, that this is right to do that type of like of actions or do this type of words. And there's a reality to all into this. There's a historical context into the racism, discrimination, hate actions, and these not in these countries. We as indigenous people, we know this is very well. One of the reasons why our organization moved from using the word of immigrants to using the word of migrants is because we recognize that we as indigenous people of this continent of America, we are continuing to migrate from one place to another one. And we believe that we are not immigrants to this continent. We are from this continent. And that borders has been created with very intentional purposes of division, of control, of the continuation of taking away from the people of these lands their resources, their lands, their languages, their culture, their beliefs, their visions. And they are being, for me, this type of hate speech that we are seeing right now is being very intentional as a way to continue to oppress us as indigenous people, in this case also as an immigrant or migrant individuals. This is a mental weapon that are being using for quite a long time. And of course, this mental weapon has been a good arm, like a weapon for them to continue with their invasion of our lands and continents. I think that I'm also thinking about the power of words, right? So when someone comes and say like, speak, you are in America, speak America. So what does that really means? And when we don't really recognize about our own history of discrimination, history of oppression, if we're not putting some times and attention to that, it's pretty, we becomes very vulnerable for believing, yes, I should speak America, but what language is that? We are in the American continent, and I wanted to say, like, you should speak Mixteco, you should speak Wabe, you should speak Nahuatl, you speak Zapoteco, and all these Chontal, Chumash language, if you are in America. I think some of the work that we as indigenous organizations that we're doing is to, you call it decolonize, claiming our indigenous roots, learning about it, because that may be the best way to stand strong against these type of actions and continue with this resiliency that we as indigenous people are being doing for more than 500 years ago. I know we're talking about in a context of political, about whoever the person is who is going out there, getting the mic and style all this, you're criminal, you're this and you're that. But we as indigenous people, we're experiencing that in a daily life, in our agriculture work area. We're being called Oaxaquitas. We're being called indigenous Indio. We're being called like you speak a dialect. It's not a language. We are being hearing, you are brown, you are short, you are ugly. We hear that every day of that type of hate speech, and not necessarily from one person. So for me, that one person going in this kind of a space is take a mic. The dangers of that is that is giving basically green light and allowing whoever's my coworker is calling me Oaxaquita, is calling me Indio, is calling me ugly, brown, short, you speak at that, is giving that person a right, like a legal right to keep that type of actions against me as an indigenous person. That's the dangerous of it. We constantly, daily, weekly, there's kids in the schools in our counties who are being bullied from Oaxaca, or for just look like a Oaxaqueño person. So if they're seeing in a TV a white person using hate words like criminals, undocumented, you're not welcome here, that reinforces the action of that other kid who is doing the actions to our kids. That's what worries us a lot. That is basically approving these type of actions of hate. We already saw it when that person was the person was running the country. We saw that the numbers of racism type of like related crime got increased a lot, because that enabled that person that basically said, yes, you can do that, because our president is doing it, and we don't want that. So I think the other thought I'm thinking about all this is that we really need to like do some serious work, continue to do this work of like calling out when we hear about words, like we ourselves, we need to do this work collectively to start changing the narrative about undocumented or illegals or criminals. We, the indigenous people of this continent, or you call it Mexicanos or other people who come from other countries, we should take the lead on undo the narrative that was being built for many years of this country. Because the narrative that we're using in the immigrant, on the politic kind of like world, does not really represent the history of this country. And we should also call out that the reason why many people are coming to this country is or the factors of why people decide to leave their lands. I think in the interview with Manuel, it was like, we don't want to leave our lands. We don't really want to leave the lands. But if we really understand why we're leaving our lands, what are the political international policy that this country is creating with governments, then we're going to understand that I'm leaving my land because of external people that are in the power making these decisions is forcing me to leave the lands. If you go to Oaxaca nowadays, you will see all these saqueos, like all these extractions, company that comes from the USA, from Canada, from Europe. They are in our states extracting all the natural resources. And what is that, how that impacts, what is the impacts to indigenous communities in Mexico and Oaxaca? Well, they don't have other like ways to compete with these companies. They don't have clean waters. There's all these extractions of our trees, are killing the trees and all this stuff. So this is like a lot of intersections issues on all these immigrations when we're talking about immigration, and we need to be able to like talk about those and that dimension.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Arcenio. I am going to now open this up for questions for all of our three speakers. And I'd like to ask, first off, have you noticed a noticeable increase in the kind of interactions you have with the white and other, even Latino, but non-Indigenous people in Ventura as a result of this escalating hate speech? Have you noticed more, as you say, more bullying of students? Are there specific examples of how this is affecting not just hearing the rhetoric, but actual examples of interactions that have intensified?
Again, I think one of the things we're noticing, not only noticing, but hearing is, and I will say this, but this is what I heard. Other Mexicanos are saying it like, let's just wait to see Trump in the presidency. So you will get deported. Like people that now they have either a USA citizen status or a green card holders. Unfortunately, and this is very harmful.
Oh.
This is very like unfortunate because we're hearing it from other Mexicanos. It's like, just wait for Trump to get in the office, and you guys are gonna get deported. Or don't do that because Trump, like the word Trump, I don't know if they even know the Trump person, but the word Trump is becoming like their escudo, I forgot the word in English, to allow them to say, we just wait for that person to get in office. Definitely we started hearing a lot about Trump around. Yeah.
Let me ask Gustavo, there was at one time a very powerful pro-immigrant movement. And I remember a las calles in Los Angeles, huge protests of immigrants, the largest the city had ever seen in street protests in support of immigrant rights. Is there a sense you have, Gustavo, that the immigrant rights movement could somehow be mobilized? I think that's partly what Arcenio is saying needs to be done in the face of this escalating rhetoric.
Thank you, Sandy. And yes, I do think that there is that potential, that very deep and felt potential, but it's going to depend a lot on the ability to communicate all of these things, like Arcenio is saying, of agency, of being able to express to them that you still have a voice. I still have a voice. I may not be able to vote, but I am able to call upon my allies. I have citizen allies. I have plenty of friends who I know if I asked, if I expressed it, if I made myself vulnerable and told them about my situation, they would come on my behalf. But it would take a lot of education. It would take a lot of strategic coordination between the different groups. just as Arcenio was mentioning to diferentes comunidades, different communities, Indigenas, Indigenous, that we don't always have the foresight of knowing that we want the same thing or that we're trying to struggle for the same thing. But if we can begin by calling upon organizations like ELF, organizations like Chirla, organizations like Siren, and many other already immigrant serving community providers that would just need to coordinate. They would just need to, again, educate to really mobilize in the way that is meaningful. And I think it's very possible.
How real do you see the threat of mass deportation?
I I usually try to stray away from that line of thinking because it'll usually lead me to a darker place. Again, given my lack of status, because as I've expressed to numerous colleagues, I'm in a very a very precarious position, right? I know that I have some privileges, but I know I don't have them completely. And even then, I know that there are literally not even millions, billions of people that would love to be in my shoes, to just have the ability to write to work and have a social. But for me, I see it as some impending threat that has a basis, especially like I said, when you consider the fanatics, the believers that have banners, that have flyers on their lawn, that if they said it's going to happen, I don't doubt that they would try to make it happen. I know that we would respond, but I'm not sure how real the threat is. I feel
Right.
it.
Right. Let me go to Manuel. And one of the points you've made, Manuel, is that it was very hard to get people working in the fields to actually express their feelings. People are afraid, as both Manuel and Gustavo and Arcenio have said. How were you able to get the farm worker you interviewed to express herself? And to what extent is she too afraid to have her name used because of the delicate relationship with non-Latino farm workers in her community?
Yes, and yeah, people is very afraid to talk not only about what is happening with Donald Trump, but now with any topic, any that could criticize anyone, even an institution, the county. How we did? Well, we have been working with ethnic media services with my colleague Peter Schurman for the last 3 years in this area. It's it's a little by little. I Juana invited me for a breakfast. It wasn't at the first point she already openly expressed what she's feeling. It was during a breakfast, but people is very afraid to talk. Even I have some interviews that then later call me and say, please do not publish anything because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what could happen. And this is one of the consequences. The people is getting afraid. We are breaking in many ways the social fabric in these communities because until now, some of these farm workers have built, let's say, a good relationship even with white population. They didn't fight a lot, is what they said. Recently, they are afraid to start fighting again, or to start just as they have to be more isolated. These are communities that are already isolated. Well, they will be more isolated because what Juanita told me, we just go to the church, come back, and try to not go anywhere. Just go to work, go to the store, go to the church, and stay in home because we don't know what could happen. That is another consequence, to keep people enclosed in their house because of the fear.
Do you see that, Manuel? Arsenio, among the farm workers in the Oxnard area and farther north as you expand? Are you seeing a similar kind of sense of fear, not wanting to really be visible?
I think the sense of fear has always been in the life of farm workers, especially undocumented individuals. The population we work with is a very not really new, but new in terms with the agriculture sector. For the last 10, 15 years, the numbers of indigenous farm workers has increased a lot. I will say 60, 70% of the ag force and the agriculture sector in California is represented by indigenous communities. And it's always been the fear of being deported. So when we started hearing this type of narrative, that fear, that feeling of uncertainty definitely increased a lot. Stress, anxiety, what's gonna happen to me? This person gets there, is he or they really gonna implement what they're saying? So absolutely, it's internally in the organization, we started the conversations about rapid response to that level. Like we got rapid response for COVID, now will be rapid response for what's gonna happen, what are we gonna do, how are we gonna help our communities to minimize as much as possible we can, and the fear, or tell them it's okay, we're gonna be okay. But it's just very unfortunate for us to be having these conversations of how do we gonna reactivate or activate rapid response in terms with helping our communities with all this anxiety, all these stress, fears that's happening.
We are almost at the end of our hour, and I would like to ask each of our three speakers a final wrap-up question, which is very selfish. We are journalists. Many of us have audiences made up of immigrants. I was really struck, Arcenio, by your differentiation between migrant and immigrant in terms of indigenous people. It's a very profound idea. But what would you recommend that ethnic media do to address the extent of anti-immigrant hate speech? You're suggesting a rapid response and calling out of the words, but tell us what you'd like to see us do in terms of covering this topic, especially impacting migrant workers. And let's start with Manuel.
Thanks, Andy. Well, I'm thinking of what happened in 2006 and 2007 during the massive demonstration in 2006. One of the answer of the next year, 2007, was a massive deportation. ICE were everywhere, and I think media did an important role into being there, being where the people is, and organizing. We didn't have smartphones at that time, but we could send text messages. And I remember I was here covering, and some people say, ICE is in some place or some checkpoints for driver license, but actually was in order to get people. But what we observe is where it was the presence of media, we kind of prevent abuses. So I think we have to be ready for that. I like the idea of with rapid response. I think we should organize, and no matter who wins this next election, we should be more organized in between us. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you. And Gustavo, any final recommendations for us in the media?
I would say keep sharing the stories of individuals like myself, like my family, my community, and keep putting a face and a name to our stories, because it's the best way to humanize us, and it's the best way to see and come to terms with, as Arcenio was mentioning, what are the reasons that we're really here, and who ultimately is deciding that. But thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be part of this.
Thank you, Arcenio. You have the last word. What would you like? Your communities are isolated from even Spanish-speaking media because so few of us have the advantage of communicating in Indigenous language. What can you advise us? What do you want to see us do more of?
Actually, I wanted to share the same point as Gustavo, and adding to that, I was saying, and what you're saying, I'm exploring the possibility of diversifying language within the media, ethnic medias. How do we start being creative on reaching out to this population with the language they speak? That's one thing to explore. And also, like, going a little bit about putting the face in the voice of the person, not writing narratives, speaking behind them, but just center the individual's stories and be very intentional on not victimizing these populations and not romanticizing our populations. I think oftentimes what we have seen is that we wanted to like say or share about the sad part of it, the unfortunate, the suffering, which is good, but at the same time, I think there's a reality to it. And I think it's really important. There's a roots, and it's really important to share about where is that coming from, how these populations got to be in these positions and be like excluded, be oppressed. And this is not about their fault. This is about, you know, much bigger stuff that comes not yesterday or a year ago. It comes from like 500 plus years ago.
Thank you. I want to add that the video that Manuel shared with us is going to be available for whoever is able to share it. It's exactly what you are recommending, hearing voices directly from people who have pride, dignity, a belief in the power of their work, and also, of course, speak to the impact of this rhetoric on their lives. So thank you to all three of you so much for sharing, and thank you to our interpreters and to our media for joining today's briefing. This conference is closed.